Hi, everyone. As you can see by the title of our talk and our discussion today, we're going to be talking about different conversations that may be happening in your home, in your schools, in your community around the recent school shooting and the tragedy that happened in Florida last week.
Right. I think we're kind of surprised, even in terms of our audience, that so many people are joining us, which is great. And we know that it's something that's been talked about a lot. So it is one of these things that even if you were thinking, okay, wait, I'm going to protect my child from this because they're young, or that it would be hard to do because of all the media coverage, all the other kids talking about it on every single level.
Yes.
So that's why we're here.
We're here.
Okay.
So again, the goal of today is really just to engage in a discussion around some of the challenging topics that might be happening in your homes. We know that they're happening here, happening in the community, at schools, related to things like gun violence, school safety, mental health, and what all this means for your kids you work with, in order to help them to feel safer and actually feel like we're doing what we can to keep them safe.
Right. I think what we're going to talk about, and maybe even focusing on at first, is this idea of mental health stigma. You know, that we've had so many questions on kids who have a certain diagnosis, and what does this mean? Like, does this mean anything? And there was a wonderful question even about a child who has been diagnosed with ASD and ADHD, similar purportedly to the shooter, and it's, wait a minute, but what we know is that 1 in 60 kids may have ASD.
Right.
That means nothing in terms of what your child is going to become. I've had kids in my office say, do you think I have? I'm like, no. You know, just because you have a mental illness does not mean that this is the outcome. So I think that's one of the few things that we can reassure a lot of kids and families on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one thing we just wanted to highlight, as you can see in the points in this slide, is just this idea that about 1 in 5 youth are going to meet criteria for a mental illness. And so we really want to make sure that people, kids, families, schools, providers know that the large majority of people with a mental illness are not committing violent crimes. They're actually much more likely to be the victims of violent crimes than they are to be the perpetrator.
Right.
And I think one of our concerns around, as Lori was saying, in terms of kids coming in and thinking, could this be me? Am I someone who could do something like this? Or could my kid be someone who could do something like this? We really just want to be thinking about what kind of message is this sending to youth who may be struggling with something like anxiety or depression or ADHD or ASD, and how does that then impact their willingness to seek help, to talk about it?
Right. And I think that's really our bottom line, is the more kids can seek help, the more families can reduce that stigma by seeing it as a normative thing to get help, to ask for help. And I think in situations like this, our concern is about the anxious kids, the kids who may have had, pre-existing mental illness or things like that they are more anxious because this is a trigger for them. And I think we're worried about their risk of self-harm. We're worried about those kind of things. And I'm sure parents are too, because they know their kids, they know what's going on. And one of our take-home messages, of course, more mental health people in schools is a great thing. That does not take away from some of the political discussions and the need for other things going on. But our message has always been, let's get help where kids are at, and that's in the schools.
Yeah, and I think, getting kids help as early as possible. So, I think thinking about looking for those sort of early signs of potential concern, and again, not in the realm of concern for necessarily risk of violence, but just concern. How is this kid doing in school? How is he doing with friends? How is he doing with family? Those types of things, and getting a sense of where do they fall in comparison to peers. We know that early intervention, as soon as we can be targeting some of these concerns, the earlier, the better.
Right. Okay. So, it's interesting that when we talk about how do we work together to promote safety, here's the negative thing about psychology. We're not a predictive science, so I wish I could tell people, who's going to develop this, that we don't know, so that even when we talk about could we have, we always look at these things in retrospect to inform us in the future, but for the most part, it's not like anyone could have, should have, would have. when we hear those could have, should have, we often think of our own anxiety.
Absolutely.
Like, oh, what if? Right. We would say, oh, you have anxiety, we've got to help you with that. Because we just don't always know, but yet we want to give people this idea that we are doing everything we can to keep them safe, ourselves safe, and that we're looking to the future. It's kind of like when someone is anxious and says, to their parent, are you going to die? Yeah. We don't want to say, no, never. Right. That's our impulse. Right. I want to say, no, we're all fine. But what we do is we say, look, we're doing everything we can to keep ourselves healthy and safe for you for a long time. And that's the reassurance, even in, I think, a situation like this, that we give the kids, that we are. Because lots of families are wondering about the drills that kids are having and whether those are good or bad. So, Randi, take it from there. Are they good? Are they bad?
I think like anything, there are probably pros and cons, right? So I think while things like active shooter drills create anxiety, right, it can make kids, teachers, right, everybody nervous about this idea of planning and practicing in case of something like this. At the same time, having a plan, feeling like you know what to do should something like this happen in your school can also be reassuring, because then otherwise you're like, what would I do if this were to happen? It's like, oh, right, I do X, Y, and Z. This is what I was told. I go to this person if I'm concerned. I, go in this room, those types of things. So while it can create anxiety, as anything talking about a really stressful situation can, it also can provide a bit of reassurance because everybody likes to have a plan.
Right, and I think that's where we talk about desensitization so that we can remain calm in a difficult situation. It's kind of how fire drills work in schools. Every kid is used to having them. Exactly. Every kid knows that they have to be quiet and line up, and teachers know that they have to take their attendance book and they meet outside. So it is not unusual for them to say, okay, we've gone through this plan. Most kids are not afraid of fire drills. Those that are often in our offices, and we're helping them with that. Right. It's the same here. If it just becomes something that is something we do, it can actually be somewhat reassuring.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, it's the adults and how they're reacting and talking about these things. So with fire drills, I would imagine for the most part, school teachers, administrators are pretty calm when going through fire drills. It's something that's just been part of the norm of being in a school for a long time. And so we want to be thinking about, as the adults, how are we representing these things, right? And being really aware of our own anxiety around these topics and our own feelings in order to present at least a somewhat neutral and calm stance for kids. We always know kids are going to look to the adults to check that they're safe, right? So whether that's parents, teachers, school administrators, so the more that the school adults are presenting this in this is just something we do so that we feel prepared, so that we all know what to do, in the same way they do for a fire drill, hopefully over time it can become less scary and more reassuring and informative.
Right. And we also know there are limits to what we can do to keep kids safe, and we're going to do the best we can.
Of course.
Having talked to lots of kids love in high school and junior high to be able to go out to lunch. So, there are certain freedoms that we may not want to take away, and with all freedom comes risk.
Yeah.
And that
high risk, high reward.
Right, exactly. We do want, one of the things we know, and this is one of the best studies, is that we do want to limit access to things as much as we can. Like there was a great study in England where they put aspirin, which can be a major cause of suicide attempts, or one of the methods, is that when they put them in blister packs and made it harder, that there were less attempts using that method. So we want to do our best to limit that as much as we can, access to things that would be dangerous for kids.
Absolutely. Sure. There's, we always have to look for the things we have control over, right? There's a lot of things that we don't have control over when it comes to protecting kids and keeping them safe. And so as much as we can look to the factors that we have some control over, such as access to means, those are things that we always want to be keeping in mind.
Right. And again, the other part is keeping in mind the developmental level of kids. So high school kids who are much more maybe activists and doing things, and this really helps them, for sure, it's a great thing to do. For younger kids, and knowing who they are personally, not just their developmental age, they may not have any awareness of it. So first you want to find out what your kid knows. and have conversations about it. You want to find out if the school has said anything, if they've seen anything, because what we also know with social media these days, kids see more than we think they do.
Yes. And hear more than they think they do.
At much younger ages. Yeah. So that's why we ask, what have you seen, what do you know, and what do you have questions about?
Absolutely. We want to take their lead in terms of following up on providing more information, correcting inaccuracies, things like that, because we don't want to provide more information than is necessary for the child's developmental level, and at the same time don't want to leave out information or not talk about it at all with older adolescents, because then we're sending the message that this is almost so scary and terrifying that I can't even talk about it.
And that's why we say it is important to talk if your kids know something, but you want to, the story I always tell is when, it's kind of like a joke when a kid comes into mom and says, where did I come from? And mom gives the entire story of sexual reproduction. The kid says, oh, Johnny came from Chicago. So we want to know what they know and what they're really asking, and then we can answer.
And if you're not sure, just clarify. I want to, I want to understand. So when you're asking where you're from, what do you mean by that?
What do you mean? Yeah. Okay.
So now we're going to walk through different members of the community in terms of thinking about, what can different organizations, individuals be doing to help. And what we mean by help is we're thinking about both in terms of talking to kids after tragedies and how to help reassure them that they're safe in spite of how scary all of this is, while also talking a little bit about different things that community members can be doing to do their best they can to keep kids safe. So we'll start with parents.
And sometimes I think what parents can do is actually talk to their kids about the reality of things. Think how boring the news would be if they said 6 million school children got home safely today. No incidents happened, and then they all did their homework, which they all hated. No one watches news for that. So it's the idea of that even though these things we understand as adults may be happening with greater frequency and things like that, there's still rare occurrences that on most days, most kids get home safely and have to go through their daily routine. So that's sometimes the things that parents need to promote. What's the reality?
Exactly.
What's going on?
Yeah, I think, similar to not being able to tell your child that you're not going to die, right? At the same time, we can't tell kids that this will never happen in their school. We don't want to say things like that, but at the same time, we want to be saying, but the rate of it, right, that these are still very low likelihood situations, even though it feels like they're happening all the time. And I think especially parents are saying to us, and look at how many shootings there have been, even in just the first 45 days of 2018, and all we can do is say yes, it's terrifying. It is a reality, and what are the measures that are in place to keep kids safe, right? And I think part of that is, as parents, is keeping your kids on their regular routine. I think remembering that this brings up so much anxiety in caregivers, right? So there can be an urge to have a fear of, sending your kids to school the next day, right? And in part, it's that modeling of coping, and that this, while this is scary, we still go on. So making sure that you're continuing with daily routines, despite, some of the fear around that, making sure that you are continuing to send your kids to school, to their activities and things like that.
And I think even those regular things, like you may be having conversations like we're talking about that may be scary, and then you want to follow it up with, oh, what snack do you want? What's the regular thing that you would ask them in the morning? Do you want to wear your pink sweater or your blue sweater? So that we're still going to make them do their homework and wear their sweaters and give them the snacks that they like, because that's what we do as parents. So to put in that safety, to understand that, and go on.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, I think keeping in mind, we talked a little bit about media, and the way that this can be presented and how frequently it's going to be shown, whether it's talking about the politics related to it, or the advocacy on behalf of the students. So just thinking about how much the media is on in the home, and if you see your teens or older children watching a lot or on Facebook, on social media, sort of all the time, reading, we just want to be mindful of how much they're taking in, and think about how you can limit it in ways that don't feel like you're taking away their opportunity to know information and absorb information that's important to them, while also recognizing that we know when kids are watching this repeatedly and listening to it over and over and over again for hours on end, it can start to have a negative impact.
Right, and it's okay to say, let's turn off the TV.
Let's take a break.
let's take a break. And that goes for the adults too. So with the younger kids, they might not be watching themselves, but if the news is on in the background, because we as adults want to hear and know what's going on, we have to realize kids hear that.
Yeah.
So there may be, let's turn it off. Let's have a typical dinner. Let's do those things. And that's, we have to limit it.
All right, and the other thing we wanted to talk a little bit about was, thinking about both how do we talk to kids about tragic events, and also what can different individuals in the community be doing, right, to help kids feel safe and to protect kids as much as we have control over it. What are some things parents can be doing in that realm?
I think what parents can be doing is saying, look, this is how, giving them even a plan, like, okay, you know how to reach mom, you know how to reach dad, the school has your phone number, has all of our phone numbers, so do you if they're a little bit older, even younger kids have cell phones now, so that they can tell them that there is a plan in place, that we will be there, we're going to come and get you if need be, so that if they ask those questions, we can reassure. You also want to know if after something like this is where, if you see a change, increase, decrease, we say this for everything, any change in your child's behavior, you want to be attuned to that because they may have concerns that you're not aware of. But that's where, again, even modeling, seeking help, so that you can model for your child, I'm anxious about this, so I talk to this person, or I call a friend, so that they see what you do when you're anxious, so we can model it, we can give them the idea of what we do to keep them safe. I think those are some important things. What else can they do?
And I think just in general, thinking of especially younger kids, to your point of not necessarily knowing everything that's going through their head. I think especially in younger kids, we really want to be looking at behavior to be able to know what's going on with them. They may not say, Mommy, I'm feeling anxious about the shooting, yet you might see that they're a little more withdrawn, or they're acting out a little bit more, they're a little more aggressive, or not following rules in the way they used to, or their appetite has changed. So really making sure you're both noticing changes in behavior, sleep, appetite, things like that, in addition to what they're actually verbalizing to you.
And call schools if you're wondering, call the guidance counselor, be in touch with the teacher, see if they're seeing anything if you are. What can schools do? Okay. Again, I feel like we put so much on schools. I feel bad for teachers and guidance counselors because it's a never-ending kind of thing of, can you guys be aware? I think most schools, have sometimes they have guidance counselors available. They have mental health professionals, hopefully in the school, never enough. That can be my next political kind of statement. More is better. That said, you'd be surprised. Some schools also have resources where people have gone into the classrooms and talked to kids about these things. You just want to know that's going on. Again, I think teachers can get back to their curriculum with the younger kids. If the older kids want to do things about activism, that can be a topic that's talked about. Some of these things are a difficult topic because people have various and very different views on things. And I think teachers are the most equipped to hear that because they hear it on everything they're talking about, whether they're reading a book or they're reading a newspaper. So I think teachers have to hear that. Then teachers should feel comfortable that if they're concerned about something, to contact the guidance counselor, to contact the parents. Better over-report than under-report. So if you see a student who you're worried about because they're nervous, they're worried, they're sad, something different, or this is a kid who always, ate his snack in 2.2 seconds and is saying, I'm not hungry. Those are things you might just want to pass on. But I always think, okay, so could you teach them how to read, can they write, do, arithmetic, and, also be aware of mental health issues. But I think they're also the ones who see it. They have our kids all day. They do know our kids.
I think teachers are an incredible resource for knowing kids, knowing the changes, even those slight changes. Teachers know their kids really well, especially younger kids that are in the classroom with them all day. I think in the middle and high schools, it can become even harder where teachers have multiple classrooms and they're only with kids for 45, 50 minutes at a time. I think an interesting conversation, which I know we won't be able to get fully into today, is around this idea of how are, social emotional skills and things like that taught in schools, right? And there's discussions around having a universal curriculum where every child or adolescent is getting access to social emotional coping skills, understanding what to do when they feel stressed, things like that. And then, of course, right, identifying those individuals who are more at risk. So I think there's just a lot of discussion around how we can be incorporating, again, more things for schools to be doing. But I think that's one area of the conversations. And I think there's a lot of things to be thinking about when it comes to that.
Again, it's normalizing it. Like
Absolutely.
When we go into a school and we are doing, Randy and I have been in schools where we're addressing lots of kids that I'm amazed that even high school kids, how receptive they are to things like relaxation, breathing, and stress management, because you almost think like, ooh, that would be like, ooh, I don't want it. They're really more receptive than you would think.
Yeah, as long as it's framed in, again, a non-stigmatizing way, that everyone gets anxious, everyone feels stressed, what you're feeling right now after this horrific thing that happened is normal and expected, who wouldn't be having a wide range of feelings. It's much more easier to take in, oh yeah, I could use a break, right? It would make sense for me to learn a skill, to do some breathing, to do some, relaxed imagery in order to feel a little bit better in the classroom.
And I think, again, we're not going to talk a lot about it today, but one of the things that I think many people have heard me talk about is even that idea of bullying programs and what is effective, and to notice when kids are being targeted or they're the bully themselves. And so there's lots of things that can happen in that realm too.
Yeah, and I think just to that point, I think there can be a focus on, one or the other, and I think it's just so important to note that we've learned from research that it's both the bully and the bullied.
And the bystanders.
Which is every other
we just covered
child in the school who are affected by bullying. And so it's just really important to be thinking of that, certainly, universally. All right, let's move on.
Sure.
Okay. Pediatricians. So, we've spoken about parents, we've spoken about schools, another sort of first line who has access to use are pediatricians. And I think this is an interesting topic because pediatricians very often may see kids and teens once a year, for their annual physical. And yet they're also medical professionals who are the most likely to consistently, in some capacity, have eyes
have someone know someone over the course of their lifetime. But it's where we often see both anxiety and mood first showing up. It's not necessarily in our office as a referral. It's the school nurses, it's the pediatrician, because of some of the somatic complaints that we see that we may not attribute to emotions, things like anxiety or mood, or because they get stomach aches, they get headaches. That what is the first thing you do if your child is saying, I don't feel well? You take them to the pediatrician. Absolutely. So the pediatricians, again, have that hard job of saying, I don't have a physiological cause for this, yet it is real. Those stomach aches are real. Kids throw up. Those headaches are real. They're debilitating. And the treatment may not be aspirin or Pepto-Bismol. It may be, let's learn some skills.
Yeah, and I think, and again, similar to schools, right, we know that pediatricians have only a limited amount of time to see each child that walks into their office, and yet we think about things like how can we incorporate more mental health screenings into pediatric wellness visits, things like that, right? Are there things that they can be catching that may not be caught, that a child may just fill out on a survey or in a brief conversation with their pediatrician because they have known them maybe since they were 5 or 6. And so, thinking about the way that pediatricians can be doing, again, even brief screens of some of these things, communicating with parents, communicating with if the child does have a mental health provider. Again, just this idea of collaboration, right? The more school, community, parents are in contact and all on the same page around the kid, I think we generally see the better outcome.
What can adolescents do? Again, because I think we saw this, especially even when we were doing work after 9/11, that we certainly want to take care of the mental health needs. And adolescents, first off, they talk to one another more than they talk to adults. So we have to help them. In what ways can they support? They also need to know that if they have a friend who's struggling, that telling them or letting an adult know is not in some ways being untrustworthy to that friend. It really is doing the best they can for them, and that's sometimes a hard thing. On the flip side, like we said after 9/11, kids who are helping their local fire department or the heroes in some of it, or doing something active to rebuild community, was something that really did help them.
Absolutely. And And I think, again, about coming back to just that idea of bystanders and social media. And I think just having conversations with adolescents, whether it's in school or at home, about what are you talking about, right, on social media? How are you communicating with other kids? What do you see other kids saying to each other? And just opening up the dialogue around these things, because I think there's just so much that we don't know about what kids are talking about between themselves. And the more we can present sort of what we call like a non-judgmental stance, right? Just being open and wondering, wanting to understand their world. I think the better, and the more likely they are to share things with us.
Right, and even what we're seeing with the Parkland kids is that they may be advocating during the day and kind of crying during the evening.
Absolutely.
So we have to address both. That this might be a positive outlook and a way to do things that doesn't take away from the pain that sometimes people feel.
Absolutely.
So, all right. What can the media do? The media can be responsible in terms of just how they report things. We're hoping that the media takes on this role of both advocacy and the idea that we can move forward and protect kids rather than promoting fear or things like that. That's not a helpful thing. Absolutely. We know that when we talk about, suicides or death by suicide, that it is not something we want to glorify in any way, that is not something we want to
get detail on.
Right, we don't need all that detail. We need to figure out the future.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that just came up recently in a different talk was this idea of making sure that we're also highlighting other stories about mental health, right? So often the stories about mental health in the media are times where there has been either, right, a suicide or a, episode of violence. And I think making sure that we're also highlighting when there are positive outcomes, right? And even just other stories talking about treatment, right? That there's actually a lot of really great evidence-based treatments for kids and adolescents with mental health concerns. And so I think just thinking about how we're telling the story about mental health, and I think the more media can help with that and be advocates for mental health instead of, and work on promoting the stigma, I think that's another area that we can look to.
Right, and I love to read an article, even though, of course, we read it with a critical eye, but like when they talk about CBT for anxiety or mood, it's great, or when they talk about, parenting for ADHD and how it can be effective and help families. Those are the articles.
Yes, right, like it is possible, right, like we know that the adolescents in Parkland, right, that they're at risk of developing post-traumatic stress symptoms, right, and ultimately potentially some may go on to develop PTSD, right, and there's really effective treatment.
Right, and so many kids are resilient.
Yes, exactly, and so many may experience even some reactions now and will not go on to even develop PTSD. And so we really just want to be thinking about all aspects of mental health when thinking about how it's portrayed. And then I think just lastly, we wanted to just have a slide of some references. Again, if you have any concerns about your child, seeking out the resources in your community, whether that's your pediatrician, schools, things like that, as well as if your child has a history of trauma, definitely those are some of the youth that we're going to be most concerned about right now in terms of the possible for an increase in symptoms. And we just have some references related to effective child treatments and understanding child adolescent mental health.
And there's a question from an emailer who I think is really an important question. And the question is how best to talk to preschoolers and kindergartners about these situations and that guns are not toys, etc. I think it is not unusual, I think for most of us, and even our own kids have had maybe a Nerf gun or a water gun, and so how do we kind of explain that this may or may not be the best toy, or it is okay? I've seen kids who were totally not allowed to have guns, and they made guns out of like bologna sandwiches and brooms, so it's not an unusual thing for kids to play out some of those themes that we see about good guys, bad guys, cops and robbers, those kind of things. But we have to make the distinction for them about what's a toy and what's not.
Yeah, and I think being really clear about that, I think it goes along with other conversations about safety and respect of other people and, right, respecting other people's bodies and personal space and things like that. I think that can all be part of those conversations, and that this is a game, this is a toy, right? And yet this is the difference. And I think it's also knowing your child, and paying really close attention to what do they look like? How are they acting when they're playing with this gun? Is it silly, right? And I think it's paying close attention and being attuned to the individual child and what they look like when they're playing with it, how they act, what are they saying, those kind of things.
Right. And the idea is that most, little kids who play with these things are not growing up violent. We even know, most of us have a visceral reaction to some of the violent video games, and the research kind of says, well, okay, it's not necessarily leading to violence. That doesn't mean we don't monitor and keep it in check. And we need to keep a balance. So we want to also encourage the sharing games, the ones that are positive, the ones that teach all the values that we want them to have.
Absolutely. And again, and the limiting, right, of the access, right? That we want them to have a lot of different toys that they're playing with, right? In addition to, if they are really into a certain video game and you as a parent feel comfortable with that, right, then it's thinking about just how much, right? Do we want them to be doing that 8 hours a day? Sure. Question number 2 is, how can we empower students to come forward when they see a friend or peer who's struggling? I think this is a really important question. I think one that we definitely deal with. It can be really hard for an adolescent or child to want to disclose something that they see going on with one of their friends. Like you mentioned earlier, I think there's a sense of like, I'm going to be, not then following through on, I'm not going to be a trustworthy friend. They're not going to be friends with me after this. Things like
that. Or even a friend says, I'm telling you this, I won't be your friend if you tell anyone.
And so I think when it comes to things like that, I think I think there's roles for the school, parents, in this to normalize the anxiety around disclosing something of a friend, right, or sharing something that a friend shared with you that's concerning, while also helping them to think about the outcomes if they do share, if they don't share, and that if this is a child that really needs help, it's something that we really want to help you to be able to do.
And I think we kind of go back to the question of, suicidal ideation and things like that. That's often the things that
or
kids,
self-harm.
or self-harm that kids don't want disclosed. But yet, for the most part, if you tell a friend, or the peers that, look, what can you live with? Okay, you cannot be my friend, but I want you alive. And I'm willing to risk that. And we know that it happens in therapy all the time, that for the most part, we can repair those relationships because our intentions are the ones that really help people.
And I think one thing I also just want to highlight is thinking about the responsibility that all adolescents sometimes take on for their friends' mental health. I know that's not exactly this question, but I think that that's something we definitely have some of the adolescents that we work with come in with, right? Sort of this feeling of, my friend is going through this, and feeling almost like a therapeutic responsibility to them. And so I think, again, it's there helping them to think about, you're not the mental health provider, and what can you do to support them, right? And part of supporting them is going to be getting them the help that they need.
Unfortunately, we have lots of questions, but we're running out of time. So this is really the last question. How do you approach the conversation with middle-aged children with PTSD? So in other words, I think what they're saying is if the child is really having some post-traumatic stress responses to some of the things that have happened, or maybe we see the kids who are most at risk are those who have had difficulties before with some of these things. We know those kids are at risk. And I think the conversation, Randi, what do you think in terms of what you would say?
I think in many ways, the way we want to approach this is normalizing, right? That if this is a child with a history of PTSD where they're experiencing an increase in symptoms following the shooting in Florida, we may want to, again, sort of normalize that often after another traumatic event, it is expected and common for people to experience an increase in symptoms during this time. I think if it's more thinking about a child where there are post-traumatic stress concerns, then again, you're describing these as, you are not crazy. These are expected reactions to something that should have never happened to you. And by giving information about PTSD symptoms, it can help the child to realize, oh, these are things that it makes sense that I'm more vigilant. It makes sense that I'm having nightmares because I went through something awful, right? And then highlighting all of the ways that we have to help them. So we always also want to be thinking about making sure that kids know that there's solutions to this. We can help you.
Sure. On behalf of the Child Study Center, we wanted to thank you for joining us today. Once you leave the webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we'd love for you to complete it so we get some feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within a day or two with a link to the recording of today's session. We hope that you can join us for our next webinar, My Child Doesn't Need More Stimulation. So why treat his ADHD with stimulants, with Dr. Rakil Jamani, who's a great doc. So tune in for that one. That's on Wednesday, February 28th at 1 p.m. Thanks again.
Thank you.